In the summer of 1945, the world stood on the edge of an unimaginable transformation. For nearly 6 years, World War II had turned continents into graveyards and cities into ruins. Nazi Germany had surrendered in May, but across the Pacific, Japan refused to yield. Every island taken by the Allies had been bought with blood. American strategists estimated that an invasion of the Japanese home islands could cost up to 1 million Allied lives and perhaps even more Japanese. Amid this calculation of human sacrifice, a secret weapon, the result of 3 years of feverish work under the Manhattan Project, was ready for use. Its creators called it simply the bomb. The weapon had been tested once, in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, under the codename Trinity. The explosion lit the sky brighter than the sun and turned the sand to glass. Watching from a distance, physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer recalled a verse from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." What they had witnessed was power beyond comprehension, and within weeks, that power would be unleashed on Japan. At dawn on August 6, 1945, a silver B-29 bomber named Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island in the Pacific. Its mission, to deliver a single uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy to the city of Hiroshima. The target was chosen because it was a major military and industrial hub, home to the Second Army headquarters and several war plants. Yet it had been largely spared from previous bombings, making it ideal for measuring the weapon's full impact. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the bomb detonated about 1,900 feet above the city center. The temperature at the core of the blast reached nearly 4,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun. Within seconds, an area of nearly 2 square miles was obliterated. Wooden houses vaporized, concrete buildings crumbled, and human beings simply ceased to exist. Those who survived the initial flash were thrown into a nightmare of firestorms, radiation, and choking dust. The sound of the explosion rolled through the valleys for miles, followed by a silence so complete that survivors later said it felt like the end of the world. The official US estimate recorded about 70,000 people killed instantly, but modern research suggests that by the end of 1945, more than 140,000 had perished from burns, injuries, and radiation. It was the first time in human history that an atomic weapon had been used against a populated city. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, a second B-29, Boxcar, took off carrying a plutonium bomb called Fat Man. Its intended target was the city of Kokura, but heavy smoke and cloud cover forced a diversion to the secondary target, Nagasaki. The bomb exploded at 11:02 a.m., 1,650 feet above the Urakami Valley. The hilly terrain contained some of the blast, but the devastation was still catastrophic. Around 40,000 people died instantly. By year's end, the toll had reached nearly 74,000. Within a week, Japan's leaders, confronted with ruin, famine, and the threat of more atomic attacks, agreed to unconditional surrender. Emperor Hirohito addressed his people by radio, breaking centuries of imperial silence, declaring that the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. For much of the world, the atomic bombings were seen as the final act that ended World War II. Yet beneath that triumphal narrative lay another, lesser-known story, one that history largely overlooked. Hidden among the tens of thousands of Japanese civilians and soldiers in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were Allied prisoners of war. These were airmen who had been shot down during raids over Japan, sailors captured at sea, and soldiers taken from earlier Pacific campaigns. By mid-1945, Japan held more than 100,000 Allied POWs across its empire, in camps from Manchuria to Kyushu. Some were used as forced laborers in mines, docks, and armament factories. Conditions were brutal, food was scarce, disease rampant, and beatings common. As the war neared its end, many camps were relocated closer to industrial centers to meet wartime production needs. Tragically, that placed some prisoners directly in the path of the atomic bombs. In Hiroshima, at least 12 American airmen were being held by the Japanese secret police, the Kempeitai, in a detention center near the Aioi Bridge, less than half a kilometer from the bomb's hypocenter. They were captured from downed B-24 and B-29 missions over southern Japan. When Little Boy exploded, the prison and everyone inside it were annihilated instantly. Their names, including Lieutenant Ralph Neal, First Lieutenant Durden Lofton, and Sergeant Hugh Atkinson, disappeared from record until decades later, when Japanese survivor and historian Shigeki Mori uncovered documents proving their presence in the city that morning. In Nagasaki, British, Dutch, and Australian POWs were forced to work at the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works, a sprawling industrial complex less than 2 kilometers from the blast center. When Fat Man detonated, the shockwave leveled the factory buildings. Dozens of prisoners were killed outright. Others died from burns and radiation in the days that followed. Some of their Japanese guards perished with them. For years, these Allied victims were scarcely mentioned in official histories. The atomic bomb narrative focused on the Japanese civilian toll and on the strategic justification for ending the war. But records from the US and Commonwealth governments later confirmed their deaths. The irony was haunting. Men who had survived capture, forced labor, and starvation died in an instant from the very weapon meant to liberate them. The presence of Allied POWs within the blast zones complicates the moral simplicity often attached to the atomic bombings. These men were not enemy combatants nor civilians. They were prisoners, bound by the Geneva Convention, awaiting release once the war ended. Their deaths blurred the lines between victor and victim. They remind us that the atomic bomb did not distinguish uniforms or flags. It consumed everything in its reach. As the smoke settled over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world's leaders confronted the dawn of a new era. The same weapon that ended the war introduced the threat of human extinction. Yet in the shadow of that global reckoning, the stories of those Allied prisoners vanished. Their families received only terse telegrams, missing in action, presumed dead. No mention of the atomic bomb, no explanation that their sons had died in the same instant that victory was secured. Today, memorials in both cities honor all who perished, regardless of nationality. At Hiroshima's Peace Park, a small plaque now lists the names of the 12 Americans who died there. At Nagasaki, the Allied POW memorial near the site of Camp Fukuoka No. 14 stands quietly among the ruins of the Mitsubishi Works. Few visitors realize that men from both sides of the Pacific, Japanese civilians and Allied soldiers, were united in death beneath the same mushroom cloud. The first chapter of the atomic age was not written only in scientific triumph or military victory, but in human loss, indiscriminate, merciless, and absolute. The shadow that stretched across Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not end with Japan's surrender. It followed humanity into every decade that came after, a constant reminder that in war, even the victors can become victims. By the time the atomic bombs fell in August 1945, the Allied prisoners of war held by Imperial Japan had already endured years of unimaginable hardship. They were men from every corner of the Allied world: Americans, British, Australians, Dutch, Canadians, and New Zealanders, captured during the early lightning victories of Japan's empire in 1941 and 1942. They came from the jungles of Malaya, the beaches of the Philippines, the burning decks of Singapore, and the shattered islands of the Dutch East Indies. When they surrendered, they stepped into a world governed not by rules of war, but by cruelty, starvation, and exhaustion. The Imperial Japanese Army viewed surrender as dishonor. In their code, shaped by the Bushido spirit, a true soldier was expected to fight to the death. To be captured was to be stripped of humanity. That belief shaped their treatment of Allied prisoners. The Japanese never formally ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of POWs, and their military system regarded prisoners not as combatants deserving respect, but as expendable labor, tools to be worked until broken. From the moment of capture, the degradation began. The march to captivity was itself often a death sentence. In the Philippines, after the fall of Bataan in April 1942, more than 70,000 American and Filipino troops were forced to march over 60 miles under the blazing tropical sun, with little food or water. Those who stumbled were beaten, bayoneted, or shot where they fell. By the end of what became known as the Bataan Death March, an estimated 10,000 men lay dead along the roadside. Similar scenes unfolded across Southeast Asia as Japanese forces pushed deeper into Allied territories. Once the prisoners reached the camps, the suffering only changed form. Conditions varied, but the pattern was universal: overcrowded barracks, rotten rice rations, rampant disease, and forced labor that broke even the strongest men. The average death rate among Allied POWs under Japanese captivity reached nearly 27%, a stark contrast to the 4% rate among POWs held by Germany and Italy. In some camps, especially in remote areas of Burma, Thailand, and New Guinea, more than half of all prisoners died before liberation. The Pacific theater's geography shaped the cruelty. Japan's war machine depended heavily on slave labor to sustain its empire. With millions of men deployed to distant fronts, the Japanese military turned to POWs and Asian civilians for labor. Allied prisoners were shipped across the empire in what became known as hell ships, cargo vessels packed beyond capacity, unmarked by Red Cross symbols, and often torpedoed unknowingly by Allied submarines. Conditions inside were suffocating. Hundreds of men crammed into dark holds, with no ventilation, barely any water, and the stench of death all around. Survivors recalled scraping condensation off metal walls to drink, and watching friends die standing up because there was no room for their bodies to fall. Those who survived the voyages were dispersed to labor camps across Japan, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia. They dug coal in the mines of Kyushu, forged steel for Mitsubishi, built airstrips and shipyards, and laid railroads through the jungle. One of the most infamous of these projects was the Burma-Thailand Railway, later immortalized as the Death Railway. Built between 1942 and 1943, it stretched 258 miles through dense jungle, swamps, and mountains. The Japanese estimated it would take 5 years to complete. Using over 60,000 Allied POWs and more than 200,000 Asian force laboris, they built it in just 16 months. The cost was staggering. Over 12,000 POWs and at least 90,000 Asian workers died from disease, exhaustion, and brutality. Malaria, cholera, and dysentery spread unchecked. Men too weak to stand were beaten until they worked. One British prisoner later recalled, "We were no longer soldiers, just skeletons that moved." In Japan itself, hundreds of small labor camps were scattered near industrial centers. By 1945, approximately 35,000 Allied prisoners were being held on Japanese soil, many working for companies that still exist today: Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Nippon Steel, and Kawasaki. The camps varied in size and severity, but conditions remained dire. Food rations were meager: a small bowl of rice, sometimes mixed with barley or weeds, and a few scraps of fish. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Many prisoners suffered from beriberi, scabies, ulcers, and tropical diseases. Their bodies were reduced to bone and skin, their uniforms little more than rags. Punishment was routine and often arbitrary. A missing button, a crooked salute, or a moment of hesitation could provoke a beating. Japanese guards, many young and indoctrinated, saw cruelty as a duty, a way to enforce discipline and avenge their fallen comrades. Prisoners were forced to kneel in gravel for hours under the sun, struck with bamboo canes, or made to hold heavy rocks above their heads until they collapsed. Despite their suffering, camaraderie persisted. Men shared the smallest portions of food, whispered songs from home, and risked their lives to care for one another. It was this fragile brotherhood that kept them alive. As the war dragged on and Japan's supply lines collapsed, the camps grew more desperate. Allied air raids destroyed transportation networks, cutting off food deliveries. Civilians and soldiers alike starved, but POWs were always last in line. In some camps, guards abandoned their posts entirely, leaving prisoners to fend for themselves. Others forced the men to work even as American bombers roared overhead. It was in this atmosphere of chaos and collapse that the final months of captivity unfolded. By mid-1945, Japan's cities were in ruins. Firebombing had destroyed Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, killing hundreds of thousands. The prisoners, already skeletal and ill, lived under a haze of smoke and uncertainty. Many heard rumors that their captors planned to kill them if Japan fell, a chilling policy referred to as the kill-all order. Japanese command instructed camp officers to execute prisoners rather than allow them to be liberated. Some massacres had already occurred in the Philippines and Borneo, where entire camps were wiped out days before Allied landings. The prisoners in Japan feared they would be next. In early August, as American bombers appeared daily over the horizon, many POWs prayed for the war to end, not knowing that the end would come in a flash of white fire. At camps near Hiroshima and Nagasaki, prisoners watched the sky turn orange as air raid sirens wailed. They believed another conventional bombing raid was coming. No one could have imagined the scale of what was about to happen. The irony is tragic. After surviving years of starvation, torture, and disease, some of these men stood at the edge of liberation, only to be consumed by the most powerful weapon ever created. When the atomic bombs detonated, they were still prisoners, too weak to run, too far from help, too forgotten to be warned. The story of these POWs is more than a footnote to the atomic bombings. It is the foundation of understanding what the blast truly meant. The men who died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not simply unlucky. They were the final victims of a system built on dehumanization and neglect. Their suffering before the atomic age explains why their deaths went unnoticed for so long, because they had already been erased long before the bombs fell. By the time Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, more than 35,000 Allied prisoners remained in captivity across its territories. Nearly 1 in 3 never returned home. Those who did were haunted for life by the memory of their comrades who vanished in camps, jungles, and now, under mushroom clouds. The Pacific War had ended, but for them, the shadow of captivity and the echo of those deaths would never fade. On the morning of August 6, 1945, as Hiroshima prepared for another humid summer day, 12 American airmen sat behind the thick wooden doors of the Kempeitai military police headquarters. They were prisoners, young, battle-worn, and already half-starved after weeks of captivity. Some had been captured only a month earlier, shot down from the skies during raids on Japanese industrial centers. Among them were members of the B-24 Lonesome Lady crew, whose final mission had taken them into the heart of enemy territory. They had survived flak, fire, and the sea, but none would survive what was about to happen. Their story begins weeks earlier in the skies over the Pacific. By mid-1945, Japan's cities were burning under the relentless assault of US bombers. The American air campaign targeted the empire's industrial backbone, shipyards, steel plants, and communication hubs. Hiroshima, though not yet heavily bombed, was a critical military center. It housed the 2nd General Army Headquarters, a large communication depot, and factories supplying the war effort. It was inevitable that Allied airmen would eventually find themselves above its skies. On July 28, 1945, the Lonesome Lady, AB-24 Liberator of the 494th Bomb Group, left its base on a mission over Kure Naval Base near Hiroshima Bay. The crew, Pilot Lieutenant Tom Cartwright and 10 others, were tasked with striking Japan's dwindling fleet. They never completed the mission. Hit by flak, the bomber caught fire and lost altitude. Cartwright ordered the crew to bail out over the inland sea. One by one, parachutes blossomed across the sky. Some men landed in the water, others in the forested hills outside Hiroshima. Within hours, Japanese patrols and local villagers captured them. The men were taken first to military outposts, interrogated, and later transferred to the Kempeitai headquarters, a 2-story building in the heart of Hiroshima, less than half a kilometer from the T-shaped Aioi Bridge, the aiming point chosen by the US for the atomic strike. It was an irony of history so cruel that no one could have imagined it. The very city that held them captive would soon be obliterated by the most powerful weapon their own nation had ever created. In the days leading up to August 6th, the American prisoners endured harsh treatment. They were beaten during questioning, accused of firebombing civilians, and denied medical care. Still, there was hope. Japan's empire was crumbling. Rumors of surrender rippled through the guards. The prisoners believed liberation was near. Some, like Lieutenant Durden Loffen, scribbled notes on scraps of paper, trying to record their final thoughts in case rescue came too late. At 8:15 a.m., hope turned to light. A blinding flash illuminated every window, followed by a heat so intense it vaporized everything within its reach. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, detonated 1,900 feet above the city, directly over the Shima Surgical Clinic, a short walk from the Kempeitai building. The blast wave struck the headquarters with unimaginable force. The roof disintegrated, the walls imploded, and the men inside, prisoners and guards alike, were incinerated instantly. In that single second, the boundaries of war dissolved. There was no victor or vanquished, no friend or foe, only light, heat, and silence. Outside, Hiroshima ceased to exist. A fireball 1 kilometer wide consumed the heart of the city. Temperatures soared above 4,000 degrees Celsius. Streets melted. Rivers boiled. Human shadows were burned onto stone. Within minutes, the entire downtown district was engulfed in a tornado of flame. Those on the outskirts stumbled through the ruins, their skin hanging in strips, their mouths begging for water. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the smell of burning flesh. Birds dropped from the sky. The world itself seemed to have stopped. For the 12 American airmen imprisoned there were no remains to recover. Their bodies were vaporized, their bones turned to dust. When Allied forces arrived months later, not a single trace of the Kempeitai headquarters was left, only fragments of the foundation and an eerie silence where it had stood. Japanese survivors later confirmed that the prisoners had been inside the building that morning. Among them were Sergeant Hugh Atkinson, Lieutenant Ralph J. Neal, Sergeant Norman Brissett, and several others from the Lonesome Lady and another B-24 crew. Their families back home never knew the details. Official US records listed them as missing in action. For decades, no one spoke of their fate. The secrecy surrounding the atomic program and the devastation of Hiroshima buried their story under layers of military silence and national guilt. It wasn't until the 1980s that a Japanese survivor named Shigeki Mori, who had been a child in Hiroshima when the bomb fell, began searching for their identities. Haunted by the memory of foreign airmen killed in his city, Mori spent 40 years tracking down documents, contacting families, and piecing together the fragments of their lives. Through his relentless work, he confirmed the names of 12 Americans killed in the blast, including members of the Lonesome Lady. He found their service records, photos, and even letters sent home before their final mission. He later met some of their surviving relatives, showing them the site where their sons had perished. For them, the revelation was both devastating and healing. After decades of uncertainty, they finally knew the truth. In 2016, during President Barack Obama's historic visit to Hiroshima, Mori stood among the survivors as a guest of honor. The president embraced him, calling him a symbol of reconciliation. The image of that hug, between an American president and a Japanese man who had spent his life honoring American dead, captured the quiet dignity of a story almost erased from history. The tragedy of the Hiroshima POWs forces us to confront the human cost hidden beneath victory's glare. The 12 airmen were not anonymous casualties. They were young men who had crossed oceans to fight a war they believed would end tyranny. They endured capture, imprisonment, and humiliation, only to die by the hand of their own country's bomb. In the logic of war, their deaths made sense to no one, not to the Japanese who held them, nor to the Americans who mourned them. Historians estimate that in addition to those killed instantly, several Allied prisoners working in nearby camps were injured or later died from radiation exposure. Among them were Dutch and British soldiers used as laborers in the city's industrial zones. Their stories, too, remained largely untold, overshadowed by the larger narrative of Japan's surrender and the dawn of the atomic age. The aftermath of the Hiroshima bombing revealed horrors beyond comprehension. Rescue efforts were futile. Hospitals had collapsed, doctors were dead, and burns appeared that no one could treat. In the ruins of the city center, near where the Kempeitai headquarters once stood, the Americans' ashes mingled with thousands of others, civilians, soldiers, and children alike. They became part of a collective silence that transcended nationality. Today, a small stone marker stands near the site of the former military police headquarters. Few visitors notice it among the trees of Peace Memorial Park. But those who stop can read the names of 12 Americans etched in quiet remembrance. It is one of the few places in Japan where enemy and victim share the same ground, honored together in death. The story of the POWs in Hiroshima is not one of blame, but of tragic symmetry. It reminds us that war's cruelty is impartial. The same fire that ended the Second World War also consumed the men who fought it, proof that in the moment of greatest destruction, humanity itself was the only true casualty. In the luminous heart of the atomic blast, these 12 airmen vanished without a trace. But their story endures, in the records uncovered by a Japanese historian, in the letters sent home from the Pacific, and in the quiet prayers of families who finally learned where their sons fell. They were among the first victims of the nuclear age, and among the last soldiers to die in the Second World War. Their shadows, burned into the city that killed them, remain as silent witnesses to the day humanity crossed its darkest threshold. By August 9, 1945, Nagasaki had become a city of shadows and fatigue. The war was collapsing around Japan, its ports blockaded, its skies ruled by American bombers. Hunger gripped every household. Few in Nagasaki knew that their city, long shielded by its mountains and narrow valleys, was about to become the next target of history's most devastating weapon. Hidden among its shipyards, foundries, and coal mines were hundreds of Allied prisoners of war. Men from Britain, the Netherlands, Australia, and the United States, forced to labor for the Japanese war industry. They had survived years of captivity, disease, and starvation. But on that morning, fate placed them beneath the second atomic bomb. Scattered across the Nagasaki region were several POW camps, each attached to industrial complexes owned by Japanese corporations such as Mitsubishi and Nippon Steel. The largest was Fukuoka Camp No. 14, perched on a hillside overlooking the Urakami Valley, a place that would soon be consumed by atomic fire. About 200 prisoners were held there. British sailors captured in Singapore, Dutch soldiers from Java, Australians from New Guinea, and a handful of Americans from downed aircraft. Their daily routine was punishing. At dawn, guards marched them through factory gates to work on docks, in coal pits, or inside furnaces forging steel for the Empire's last weapons. Food was little more than a thin broth and a handful of rice. The men were gaunt, their uniforms reduced to tatters, their skin marked by malnutrition. Yet even in misery, they clung to hope. Rumors of Japan's defeat had spread since the fall of Okinawa. The prisoners sensed the war was ending, that liberation was near. On that morning of August 9th, they looked toward the harbor and saw the sky dotted with American aircraft. Some whispered that it might be their rescue. Others simply went back to work, too weak to imagine freedom. At 11:02 a.m., a single B-29 named Boxcar released a bomb nicknamed Fat Man. It drifted through the clouds and detonated 1,650 feet above the Urakami Valley. The explosion unleashed a force equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. In an instant, the valley became a furnace. Houses vanished. The Cathedral of Urakami, one of Asia's largest, disintegrated. The hills reverberated with a sound beyond comprehension. At Fukuoka Camp No. 14, the men felt it before they heard it, a pressure that crushed their lungs, followed by a flash that turned daylight to white fire. The blast wave shattered windows, tore doors from their hinges, and hurled men across the room. Roof tiles became shrapnel. Guard towers collapsed. One prisoner later recalled that the air itself seemed to explode. The camp stood about 1.8 miles from the hypocenter, just far enough to avoid total annihilation, but close enough to plunge its occupants into a living nightmare. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then came chaos. Fires erupted in the barracks. The sickbay roof caved in, trapping wounded men beneath beams. Radiation, though unseen, began its invisible assault. Within hours, survivors were vomiting, bleeding from their gums, their skin blistering in strange purple burns. The Japanese guards, many injured themselves, fled down the hillside, leaving the prisoners in confusion. From the camp, the men could see the city below, a sea of flame and black smoke rising where Nagasaki had stood. Those who could still walk stumbled into the valley to search for water or help. The scene defied belief. The ground was littered with bodies, civilians, soldiers, animals, all burned beyond recognition. The once busy Mitsubishi shipyard was gone. Steel frames lay twisted like ribbons. A British prisoner named Arthur Bond later described how the survivors wandered through ruins, where no city existed anymore, only silence, heat, and ghosts. Over the following days, radiation sickness spread through the camp like wildfire. Men who had seemed uninjured suddenly collapsed, their hair falling out, their skin peeling away. Some died within hours, others after days of agony. The camp doctor, himself a prisoner, did what he could with no medicine, cooling burns with dirty rags, sharing the last drops of water. In the nights that followed, the wounded called out for mothers, wives, and God, their voices fading into the thick, metallic air. When news of Japan's surrender arrived less than a week later, the men could hardly believe it. Liberation had come, but too late for many. Nearly 1/3 of the prisoners at Fukuoka Camp No. 14 died from burns or radiation in the days after the bombing. Others succumbed later, aboard American hospital ships, as their bodies broke down from within. Those who lived carried the invisible scars for life, not only the sickness that would haunt them, but the guilt of survival. For decades, the story of the Nagasaki POWs remained in the margins of history. The focus was on Hiroshima, on the horror of civilian casualties and the political legacy of nuclear warfare. But in the quiet archives of London, Canberra, and The Hague, records told a parallel tale of men who were both prisoners and witnesses, victims and survivors. The British National Archives later confirmed that more than 200 Allied POWs were present in Nagasaki during the bombing, held across multiple camps. Some were working at Mitsubishi's foundries. Others were forced laborers in coal mines just outside the city. Their testimonies, written in trembling handwriting after the war, described the atomic blast not as a weapon of victory, but as an apocalypse that ended their captivity through destruction. One Dutch survivor, Jan van Maranen, recalled standing at roll call when the flash blinded him. "It was as if the world had been erased," he wrote. "When the light faded, nothing of Nagasaki remained. The guards had vanished. We were free, but there was nowhere left to go." His words capture the cruel paradox of that day, freedom arriving in a city without life. When Allied forces reached Nagasaki later that month, they found the camps in ruins and the survivors skeletal. Medical officers recorded symptoms they had never seen before: burns that would not heal, gums bleeding uncontrollably, fevers that came and went like waves. Few understood they were witnessing radiation sickness. The war was over, but the suffering had only begun. Today, memorials in Nagasaki mention the foreign prisoners who perished there. Near the site of the old Fukuoka Camp No. 14, a small stone monument stands amid quiet trees, engraved in English, Japanese, and Dutch, in memory of the prisoners of war who lost their lives in the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. Few tourists find it, but those who do sense the weight of silence that surrounds it. The Allied POWs of Nagasaki remind the world that even in a moment of triumph, war spares no one. They were soldiers who survived captivity only to witness the birth of the nuclear age from within its inferno. Some lived to tell their story. Others became part of the city's ash, their names carried away by the wind that followed the blast. Their suffering binds nations together in a single truth, that beneath every banner of victory lies a field of forgotten graves. 4 decades after the atomic bombings, the story of the Allied prisoners of war who perished in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was buried beneath layers of silence. The world remembered the mushroom clouds, the civilian suffering, and the dawn of the nuclear age. But the handful of Allied airmen and soldiers caught inside those infernos were forgotten. Their names faded from official records, their families left with only telegrams marked missing in action. History had moved on, but one man in Japan refused to let them disappear. His name was Shigeki Mori. He was just 8 years old when the bomb fell on Hiroshima. That morning, he had been walking to school when a flash brighter than the sun threw him into a river. When he climbed out, the city was gone. All around him were people burning, crying for water, their skin hanging in ribbons. He survived, but his childhood ended in that moment. In the years that followed, Mori carried a single question: who were the strangers who died among us that day? In the 1970s, while working as a local historian, Mori stumbled upon an overlooked document, a Japanese police report mentioning foreign airmen who had been in Hiroshima at the time of the bombing. That discovery ignited a lifelong mission. He began searching for the truth about those men. What he found was astonishing. Using Japanese archives, US military files, and letters preserved in American families' attics, Mori reconstructed the final days of 12 American prisoners, captured airmen held in the Kempeitai military police headquarters, only blocks from the bomb's hypocenter. Over the next 4 decades, Mori pieced together the fragments of their lives. He tracked down their families across the United States, showing them photographs, maps, and the few surviving Japanese testimonies. He stood at the site of the destroyed prison and placed flowers there every year, even when no one came. It was through his persistence that these men, once nameless in official records, finally received recognition as atomic victims. His research culminated in memorial plaques at Hiroshima's Peace Park, inscribed with their names. Mori's work became a symbol of reconciliation. In 2016, when US President Barack Obama visited Hiroshima, Mori was among the survivors who greeted him. During the ceremony, Obama embraced the aging historian, thanking him for honoring both American and Japanese dead. The image of that moment, an American president and a Japanese survivor united by memory, traveled around the world. It represented something larger than politics, the quiet triumph of remembrance over oblivion. Beyond Hiroshima, historians and archivists have worked to uncover similar stories from Nagasaki and other Japanese camps. The British National Archives and the Australian War Memorial contain diaries, camp logs, and interrogation notes that, once cross-referenced with Japanese labour rosters, confirmed the presence of Allied POWs in the atomic blast zones. Many of these documents were sealed for decades after the war, partly to protect classified wartime intelligence and partly because governments preferred to focus on Japan's surrender rather than its prisoners' suffering. These archival efforts revealed how scattered fragments, a faded photograph, a Red Cross manifest, a letter intercepted by censors, could rebuild lives erased by war. British POW testimonies from the Nagasaki region describe seeing a light like magnesium fire, followed by a wall of heat. Dutch and Australian survivors later recorded their experiences with Allied investigators, describing radiation sickness long before science understood it. Together, these records form a mosaic of endurance and loss, a hidden chapter of the atomic age, recovered piece by piece. Yet for decades, the story remained absent from public consciousness. Part of the neglect stemmed from the overwhelming scale of civilian tragedy. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of humanity's capacity for self-destruction, a moral and political debate that left little space for other narratives. Another reason was bureaucratic silence. POW lists were incomplete. Many names were misfiled or classified. The overlapping traumas of Japanese survivors, Allied victims, and wartime guilt made the subject too delicate to confront. In both nations, it was easier to remember selectively, to grieve within familiar boundaries. Only through the persistence of individuals like Mori did those boundaries begin to dissolve. His work, and that of archivists worldwide, transformed the faceless into the remembered. Their stories remind us that history is not just written by victors or governments, but by witnesses who refuse to forget. The Allied POWs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were once invisible in the vast narrative of World War II. Today, their names rest among those of civilians, etched in stone beside the Peace Dome and the river that once ran red. Their rediscovery is more than an act of remembrance, it is an act of justice. Each name reclaimed from obscurity restores a fragment of truth to the record of humanity's darkest hour. And in the quiet pages of archives, in the testimonies preserved by survivors, and in the tears of a Japanese man who made it his life's work to honor them, the voices of the forgotten finally speak again. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the devastation was not confined to the first instant of light. For those who survived that impossible second, civilians and Allied prisoners alike, the real horror unfolded in the days that followed. The cities were reduced to burning wastelands, their air thick with radioactive dust and the stench of death. Those who lived through the flash found themselves trapped in a silent, poisoned world, where every breath and every drop of water carried a new kind of invisible danger. For the Allied prisoners of war who had survived years of starvation, disease, and brutality, survival after the bomb was both a miracle and a curse. Their bodies were already weakened beyond endurance, malnourished, infected, and scarred from labor in coal mines and shipyards. When the bombs exploded, many were thrown into darkness as their barracks collapsed. Some crawled out of rubble with burns that glowed like molten wax. Others staggered through the ruins, unable to comprehend what had happened. The Japanese guards had fled, the sky was raining black soot, and the horizon was a wall of fire. In Hiroshima, where the 12 American airmen perished instantly, there were no survivors among the prisoners. But in Nagasaki, at Fukuoka Camp No. 14 and nearby labor sites, dozens of British, Dutch, and Australian POWs lived through the initial blast. They were about 2 miles from the hypocenter, far enough to escape vaporization, yet close enough to be struck by radiation and flying debris. Many suffered ruptured eardrums and shattered bones as the blast wave tore through the camp. Windows exploded inward, slicing through skin. Fires broke out in the barracks, igniting straw mats and clothing. The men stumbled into the open, choking on ash, their eyes scorched by the blinding light. Radiation had entered their bodies before they even knew what it was. Within hours, nausea swept through the camp. Men began vomiting uncontrollably, their mouths filled with a metallic taste. By nightfall, purple blotches appeared on their skin, signs of internal bleeding. Some prisoners tried to drink from puddles, desperate for water, unaware that the rain itself was radioactive. Their captors, many injured and terrified, offered no help. Medical supplies were non-existent. Over the next few days, the symptoms grew worse. Hair fell out in clumps. Mouths bled without stopping. The burns deepened, turning black around the edges. The camp's few medics, themselves prisoners, could do little but clean wounds with dirty rags and share what little rice was left. Men who had survived malaria and dysentery now faced an invisible enemy that no one understood. They had no name for it yet, but the world would later call it acute radiation syndrome. Historians believe that in the weeks after the Nagasaki bombing, at least 1/3 of the surviving POWs died, not from the explosion, but from radiation and infection. Those who endured longer carried lifelong scars. Their teeth crumbled, their bones ached, their skin peeled away in strange patterns. Many suffered chronic fatigue and cancers that appeared years later. Doctors, when they finally reached the camp after Japan's surrender, were baffled by what they saw. American and British medical teams recorded strange blood abnormalities, immune system collapse, and burns that refused to heal. They realized these men had been poisoned by a force that could not be seen or touched. For the prisoners, the psychological torment was as brutal as the physical pain. They had endured captivity believing freedom would come with rescue. Instead, liberation arrived in a dead city, its streets glowing faintly at night. When Allied troops finally entered Nagasaki in late August, they found survivors skeletal and delirious, living among ashes. Many POWs could not even stand to salute their rescuers. One British officer described them as men already half dead, moving through a world that no longer existed. Even after evacuation, the suffering continued. On hospital ships bound for Okinawa and Manila, some prisoners who had appeared healthy suddenly collapsed and died. Autopsies revealed destroyed bone marrow and hemorrhaged organs, the delayed killing power of radiation. The survivors who returned home carried the burden of memories that no one wished to hear. Their accounts were often dismissed as exaggerations. Governments, eager to control the narrative of victory, avoided publicizing Allied casualties from the atomic bombings. It was easier to tell the story of the bombs as saviors, not destroyers. Decades later, researchers at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and National Archives in Britain and Australia confirmed what survivors had long known, that exposure and malnutrition had made POWs uniquely vulnerable. Their emaciated bodies absorbed radiation faster. Their weakened immune systems offered no defense. Even minor wounds turned fatal. Some survivors died years later from leukemia or stomach cancer, lingering echoes of August 1945. Yet, amid the tragedy, their endurance remains remarkable. A few lived into old age, giving interviews to historians, their voices trembling but clear. They spoke not with anger, but with quiet astonishment, at the randomness of survival, at the fact that they had witnessed both the end of their imprisonment and the birth of a new age of terror. The long-term legacy of those days extends far beyond the camps. Their suffering helped shape the early understanding of radiation sickness. Allied doctors studying the POW survivors' medical records provided crucial data for future nuclear safety research. But to the men themselves, the science meant little. What remained was a lifetime of pain, flashbacks, and unspoken grief. In the end, the Allied prisoners who survived the atomic blasts bore witness to something no one else on Earth could describe: what it meant to live through the moment humanity crossed into the nuclear age. They had survived starvation, cruelty, and war, only to confront a weapon that erased the very idea of survival itself. And though their names rarely appear in history books, their bodies carried the proof of that day, a silent testimony etched in scar tissue and memory, reminding the world that even victory can burn too bright to bear. The inclusion of Allied prisoners of war among the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reshapes our understanding of the atomic bombings in profound ways. For decades, the narrative of August 1945 was framed as a moral crossroads, the atomic bomb as both the weapon that ended a devastating war and the instrument that unleashed an age of fear. The focus fell almost exclusively on two groups: Japanese civilians, whose suffering became a symbol of the bomb's human toll, and the military strategists who justified its use as a necessary evil. The Allied POWs, however, occupied neither space. Their presence in the blast zones collapses the boundaries between enemy and ally, soldier and civilian, victim and victor. They reveal that even the liberating weapon of democracy was capable of consuming its own. Their story challenges the comforting divisions that have long defined wartime morality. The atomic bombings were often defended as military operations, justified by the argument that Hiroshima and Nagasaki housed military industries and command centers. But the deaths of imprisoned Allied airmen and laboring POWs defy that logic. They were neither targets nor combatants. They were captives, disarmed and defenseless, held behind barbed wire under Japan's control. Their deaths blur the distinction between military necessity and moral catastrophe, showing how modern warfare, in its quest for total victory, erased the line separating enemy from human being. This revelation also exposes the fragility of historical memory. In the grand narrative of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, certain categories of victims have dominated, primarily Japanese civilians, whose stories rightly define the horror of nuclear war. Yet, as historians have noted, this emphasis inadvertently narrowed the field of remembrance. Allied POWs, foreign laborers, and even Korean conscripts who died in the blasts were long omitted, relegated to footnotes. The absence was not deliberate cruelty, but the result of how nations construct memory. Japan, as the vanquished, sought to frame the bombings as a national tragedy. The United States, as the victor, focused on moral justification and scientific achievement. Between these two poles, there was no space for ambiguity, no space for victims who belonged to both sides. Historians now recognize that these overlooked lives complicate the established moral map of the war. They force us to confront a truth that defies national narratives, that suffering in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was universal. The bombs did not discriminate by uniform or citizenship. The inclusion of Allied POWs reveals that the nuclear age began not with a clear division between good and evil, but with shared devastation, a single human tragedy viewed from opposing sides of history. The ethical implications are vast. How do we reconcile victory with the knowledge that our own men were among the dead? What does justice mean when a weapon meant to save lives destroys those it was supposed to protect? These questions reach beyond 1945. They echo through every military decision since. The story of the POWs reminds us that in total war, morality becomes blurred by the very logic of survival. It shows that even righteous causes carry shadows, and that progress purchased through annihilation leaves wounds that no triumph can heal. In recent decades, remembrance efforts have begun to bridge the silence. Japanese survivors like Shigeki Mori dedicated their lives to identifying the lost airmen and returning their names to history. Joint memorials in Hiroshima and Nagasaki now include plaques honoring Allied victims alongside Japanese civilians. Former enemies have stood together at these sites, not to debate justification, but to acknowledge shared humanity. Each flower laid there is not merely a tribute to the dead, but a step toward reconciliation, proof that memory, once fractured by war, can become a common ground for peace. The story of the Allied POWs is more than an overlooked detail of World War II. It is a mirror reflecting the contradictions of the modern age, an age in which science, patriotism, and moral certainty converged to create a weapon that spared no one. Their inclusion in the narrative of Hiroshima and Nagasaki demands that history be told in full, without silence or simplification. Because in the end, to remember all the victims, civilian or soldier, Japanese or Allied, is not to weaken any nation's story. It is to restore what war always takes first, our shared humanity. 80 years after the skies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki burned white, the world still walks in their shadow. The story of the Allied prisoners of war who perished or suffered in those cities is not just a forgotten footnote of World War II. It is a warning about what happens when war erases individuality, when history chooses convenience over completeness. Their story belongs to the present as much as to the past, because it forces us to ask what kind of memory we choose to preserve, and what kind we allow to vanish. In both cities, remembrance has slowly evolved from national mourning to a shared human reflection. In Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park, a small plaque bears 12 American names, airmen who vanished in the Kempeitai prison when Little Boy exploded overhead. In Nagasaki, a quiet stone stands near the site of Fukuoka Camp No. 14, engraved in English, Japanese, and Dutch, in memory of the prisoners of war who lost their lives in the atomic bombing. Each year, relatives of Dutch and British prisoners travel to these sites, laying wreaths beside Japanese survivors. The ceremonies are intimate, far from the spotlight of official commemorations, but they carry immense symbolic weight, proof that reconciliation is not born from politics, but from shared grief. Remembering the Allied POWs alongside Japanese civilians reshapes how we think about responsibility, morality, and loss. It reminds us that history's boundaries are artificial, that in the face of atomic fire, nationality meant nothing. The same light that consumed Hiroshima's schoolchildren also consumed Allied soldiers who had once fought against them. To acknowledge that truth does not diminish anyone's suffering, it expands it into something collective, something profoundly human. By remembering every victim, from the Japanese mothers clutching their children to the Allied men behind prison walls, we confront the universal cost of war. That pain recognizes no flag. This inclusive remembrance carries urgent relevance today. Nuclear weapons remain a shadow over humanity, and debates about deterrence often treat them in abstract terms, as strategies, not human catastrophes. Yet the story of the POWs forces nuclear policy to confront the moral reality behind its theories. It demands that discussions about acceptable losses and strategic necessity never forget the faces behind those words. Their deaths highlight the enduring importance of humanitarian law and the protection of prisoners, civilians, and non-combatants, principles too easily dismissed in the name of victory. But perhaps the greatest danger lies in forgetting. When we exclude the minority victims, those who don't fit neatly into our national narratives, we distort the truth. History becomes comforting instead of honest. The Allied POWs remind us that memory must be courageous, that it must include even the inconvenient dead. Because only by acknowledging every loss can humanity begin to learn from its own violence. The legacy of these men lives on not through monuments alone, but through the questions they leave behind. What is victory worth if it demands silence? What does peace mean if remembrance remains selective? Their story teaches that reconciliation begins when memory becomes whole, when enemies share the same ground of mourning and look together into the past, not for blame, but for understanding. In the end, the lesson is simple and timeless. War's tragedy is never one-sided, and history's duty is not to glorify, but to remember. The shadows left by those prisoners, faint, almost erased, still stretch across the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, urging the living to see beyond borders, beyond pride, and to ensure that no victim, however forgotten, remains unseen.